Generative AI, or Gen AI, is everywhere, and many of us feel increasing pressure to adopt it. But how can we use it ethically and practically? And what principles and practical steps can help us navigate Gen AI thoughtfully? Today, we're joined by Jake Hirsh-Allen, Head of Partnerships at the Dais, a public policy and leadership think tank at the Toronto Metropolitan University. Jake has a strong background in tech and has been involved in many initiatives that guide Canadian organizations in how they can and should use technology responsibly and ethically, not just Gen AI. Most recently, he's been leading the Responsible AI Adoption for Social Impact, or RAISE program, a national initiative through which Jake has trained over 500 nonprofit professionals across Canada. So, Jake is well placed to share 5 practical and good ideas on how to adopt artificial intelligence. In his presentation, he will explore when and how to use AI and the risks you need to understand. He will also talk about the importance of creating a living AI governance policy and knowing how to use AI tools for fundraising, programming, and operations. So, welcome, Jake.
Thanks so much, Elizabeth. It's great to be here.
So, it's over to you. I think all of us have a million questions in our head about AI. I'm terrified of it. I have used it reluctantly once or twice. And I think I'm probably the classic tread carefully and are you sure we have to do this kind of person. So that's who's going to be on this end of the conversation for you.
Totally fair. I'm super excited to be here. Maytree has been an inspiration throughout my career, and only recently have I been able to connect with you all via the Dais, a relatively new home for me, where I've been for about 9 months now, full time at least. I've been collaborating again with them for many years now. And this topic is really dear to my heart because I have been feeling the pressure that you just described myself. Started feeling it most intensely when a fellow Torontonian and now Nobel Prize winner Geoffrey Hinton began writing about his fears around artificial general intelligence, which I'll be clear is not what we're going to be talking about today, but is very much a topic du jour and has often been confused with generative AI, which is what we're talking about today, in part because Hinton is one of the inventors of Gen AI, and as in that role, he's got fear. He's quite afraid. He's in fact terrified, I think he would say, that we're going to go from Gen AI to AGI. I am frankly less afraid than him. Please, Elizabeth.
Can you just give us a definition between the two? Like, let's distinguish that right at the outset.
100%. Yeah, no, super helpful. So, Gen AI is a relatively new invention, but it builds on many existing forms of artificial intelligence that we have been using for many years now and which are baked into a huge amount of the software that is used on a day-to-day basis. So, as an example, semantic analysis and natural language processing are two very complicated words that basically mean how a computer can understand human words and human meaning. So the combination of those words into meaning. And that science has evolved dramatically with machine learning, which is when a computer can, again, learn, as the word would suggest, from our inputs and then generate in this new form content as a result of that learning. So Gen AI is really the combination of those different technologies with a new technology, and this is where Geoffrey Hinton and Yoshua Bengio and others come into the picture. For many, many years, we were frustrated by the lack of dramatic advances in machine learning. And what those two, among others, contributed to was the creation of neural networks. So things that really resemble how our brains work in terms of having a network of neurons that fire. And in fact, partly why we still don't, to this day, understand exactly how Gen AI works is because it's based on these neural networks that, like our brain, are still unclear to us in terms of how exactly they come up with the meaning or the content that Gen AI is creating. So add that all together, and Gen AI is the latest form of artificial intelligence, a part of the machine learning universe that specifically is able to, as the name would suggest, generate content in response to a human prompt or input. AGI, which is used sometimes interchangeably with superintelligence, so artificial general intelligence, has not yet been discovered, and the timeline for its discovery is extremely unclear. It is defined loosely as artificial intelligence which is smarter than a human in every way, capable of doing all the things that humans are in every way better than we are. super, super general definition for an extremely complex topic, obviously, that we're not going to, I think, delve into in depth today. But partly what we at the Dais, as a think tank, and many others, like the another Nobel Prize winner from the same year as Geoffrey Hinton, but who won the prize instead of for inventing large language models, excuse me, specifically neural networks, rather a guy named Daron Acemoglu, who we actually hosted at our most recent annual conference, Democracy Exchange, here in Toronto, and was on the Tonight Show last week as well. Um, he won the Nobel Prize for the impacts of AI on our economy and society. And he would say that we should be less scared of AGI and more focused on how Gen AI is impacting productivity, our economy, our labor market, and then preparing for the same for AGI and superintelligence. And the reason, in part, he says that is because the timeline is so unclear.
Mm.
Right now, we have Gen AI. It is changing how people work on a day-to-day basis. Artificial general intelligence will likely come at some point in the future, and the advances in Gen AI are making that more likely every day. But every decade for the past 7 decades, literally since at least the 1950s, the leading artificial intelligence scientists have said in this decade, we will get to AGI, to artificial general intelligence or superintelligence, and it has not happened. So one thing we have to bear in mind is this timeline really isn't clear. And the last thing I'll say on this topic is the folks who are making the strongest arguments for the power of Gen AI and the likelihood that we'll get to AGI as a result of its influence or powers are also the ones who have the most interest in describing it as super powerful, i.e., it is big tech and the frontier AI companies. It is their bankers, their investors, and their
Mm.
consultants who are all saying this generative AI technology should be used by everybody and could get us into one of the most dangerous situations ever because it's so powerful that it's going to result in us inventing the next stage, which is artificial general intelligence. And that's in part why our think tank and many others are suggesting we need to pour a little bit of cold water on this hype cycle. We need to breathe and understand that we are still in control of this technology. And since we are in control of the technology, since we contain, or we retain, I should say, the agency, that should actually allow us to choose how we're going to use it. And I think the thing that I took most powerfully from Daron's visit to Toronto and his most recent remarks on TV were that if we do still have agency, if, in my opinion, we should not be using the term agentic to describe so much of how AI is working, then we should leverage that agency. We should leverage the fact that for the first time, perhaps in history, for a technology this powerful, we are aware we're going through the AI revolution. We weren't aware we were going through the Industrial Revolution. So this time, and I think this conversation is actually a part of that process, let's take advantage of that knowledge to direct the technology in a socially beneficial manner, to use the technology in a manner that doesn't just benefit a small number of people and a small number of companies and concentrate wealth and power further, which unfortunately a lot of technology and software has done over the past decades and even beyond. And instead, let's use it to create a better world because it can be used, like many general technologies, for both purposes.
Right. So basically, I need to get my head out of the sand. Cooler heads will prevail, and we will get started.
I
So,
hope so. I hope so. I mean, frankly, no comment on your head being in the sand. To the contrary, I hope cooler heads will prevail. And I think it's conversations like this. The one ask of Daron when he came was, please have more conversations about how we want to be using AI in our society, how we want to be using technology in our society, and what kind of society we want to be creating. Because so much of the dialogue right now acts as if we have no influence on that. We have no power over that. And I think giving folks back a sense of agency, of belonging in the process of creating the world that they live in, the society that they operate in, is really powerful. And maybe, again, the last thing I'll say here is Canada is somewhat unique. We are in the developed countries amongst the sort of OECD or G7 nations, et cetera, amongst the lowest adopters of generative AI.
mm,
And that's despite being relatively high adopters of technology more generally and having an extremely highly educated population. And originally, I thought that was really bad for our economy, bad for our productivity, and scary. I thought we were falling further and further behind. Recently, I've begun to change my mind. I think it actually might be a natural human defense mechanism where Canada, having a population that sort of loosely resembles the world in terms of its demographic diversity, et cetera, and one that is, again, relatively educated about the potential positives and negatives, risks and harms associated with technologies like AI, and benefits from a productivity, et cetera standpoint, that people are almost subconsciously resisting adoption. They're pushing back until they're more confident that this is something that will actually improve their lives.
That resonates.
Appreciate it. I'm so glad. And I think that's, again, partly why we're having this conversation so that everybody else on this call can begin at home, et cetera, to have these conversations. There's an interesting analogy. The Dais works on three subjects: tech, education, and democracy. On the education front these days, we spend a lot of our time on K-12 education and specifically how kids are interacting with tech, how kids are interacting with screens. For instance, we have a large initiative called Heads Up. And in that respect, one of the most tragic findings of a bunch of studies that we've been working on reveal that parents aren't talking to their kids about technology. That one of the fundamental problems is
Hmm.
if you look at up until the age of, I'm going to get the numbers wrong here, but it's something like up until the age of 10, the average parent spends less than 30 minutes specifically talking to their kids about technology or screen time. And that, in my opinion, is highly problematic because it is actually through these conversations that we're going to be able to come up with our own values, decide what path we want to take, and again, regain that agency.
Great. So you've got 5 good ideas for us.
I do indeed. And I think these ideas are meant to be thought starters more than comprehensive explanations of how to use AI. And they're really meant to balance those two sides I just suggested, the productivity benefits and the risks. The first one is about, to use your metaphor, pulling one's head out of the sand. And the best way to do that is by experimenting, not with sensitive data, not at an enterprise level, not across your entire nonprofit, but rather as individuals in safe sandboxes, ideally using the most ethical large language models or chatbots that you possibly can. Begin experimenting so that you can teach yourself how these things work. And I can begin listing some examples, for instance, of safer, more ethical models and of the kinds of prompts. In fact, as you suggested, we've been teaching classes for the past 9 months. We've taught almost 600 individuals across almost that number of nonprofits and foundations about how they can either use AI for nonprofits or govern it. And in those conversations, partly what we've begun to do is increase the comfort with a technology that does require some practice and experimentation to understand when it's going to get something wrong and lie or hallucinate, as it's called, or when it's going to save one a ton of time because it's able to do something that would take, in some cases, many people many hours very, very quickly. So I'm happy to get into some of those examples, but I think maybe to begin in terms of experimentation, um, I think it's worthwhile looking at which models, again, are more ethical and safer, and which organizations are, as I said earlier, peddling these models for their own financial benefit versus doing so in a manner that is really meant to help the population writ large. So as an example, Mozilla in at the sort of international level, in Switzerland, there's a model called Apertus that has been made available to the public via something called the Public AI Network, which I've been working with for some time, and we'll put some links into the chat to these as we go. But publicai.co is where you get that Apertus model. And then for those who are, for instance, more worried about the sustainability or environmental impacts of the use of AI, there are even local models. So for instance, Mozilla and the Allen Institute both have models that you can leverage on your own local computer. And I'm going to let folks go to those websites to explore which ones are right for them, particularly because they often, at this point, do require a greater degree of technical knowledge than the average nonprofit, let's say, would have if they don't have, an IT person or a coder. But to the extent that you're able to use, for instance, one of those local models, it's going to be using much, much less electricity and fresh water than one of the larger language models that are using the kinds of data center resources that are often in the news justifiably because of the significant environmental impact of this technology.
So just to clarify,
Please.
a local model, you're using larger word, I think it was the term you used,
Yeah, large
is
language with small language model.
language. And so is language a function of how big the platform is, or is it a like because you're saying it's more ethical and smaller if it's local, so I'm not drawing from water resources and energy, and that's a proximity question, not a size of the platform.
No, it's actually both.
It's both.
So
Okay.
it's both. It's the fact that proximity in terms of this thing having to travel across obviously the internet, et cetera, but the vast majority of the energy usage is based on the size of the language model, how much of how many resources were used to train it and to do what's called inference on it, so to begin asking it questions. And in both cases, those resources, it's much more resource intensive if you use what's called a large language model than a small language model. And there's a quite active debate right now over whether the future of generative AI and AI in general is going to be large language models, sorry, or small language models. Um, and I think that debate is actually one of these really healthy conversations that has to happen more because it could provide a path both to more sustainable generative AI usage and to much more local control. So, for instance, in Canada right now, there is, I think, a long overdue and very active debate around digital sovereignty, around the degree to which we are able to control our own data, and we'll get to data more at the end of this conversation, but our own resources more generally. So, for instance, access to software or a large language model is a part of that sovereignty conversation, particularly when the vast majority of the models that folks are currently using, ChatGPT, Anthropic's, Claude, Google's Gemini, etc., are all run by American companies, subject to American law, and in part being run by some of the same people who, in my opinion, are having an unfortunately large influence on both US politics and global politics in a way that is harming Canada through things like a trade war. So, the point being, if we want to regain some of that control as Canadians, we need to find more local models or build Canadian alternatives. And we at the Dais have been advocating for that in a variety of forms with partners like the Shield Institute and others.
Okay. That's good. So it's ethical, it's environmental, it's data control, it's sovereignty. All of these are elements and criteria of how we choose what model to use.
Precisely. And frankly, that leaves folks feeling confused.
Hmm.
So I think to begin with, as I said, you can probably start experimenting with some of these larger language models using small experiments that don't use up a ton of resources and that don't put your organization at risk. And once you've become familiar and decided, and this is the biggest challenge for most organizations, decided where, when, and how to use generative AI, at that point you can decide also which model to choose from. And the reason I say this is the most important part is we spend a ton of the time in our course trying to persuade folks to first do the organizational analysis, the strategic planning to understand which challenges are appropriate for Gen AI or another technology. And that's the step that most organizations skip or don't spend long enough. The evaluation of your own organizational challenges and sort of the forming either, I think most organizations will have a strategy already, but in the case that you don't, it's worth either having your board or leadership team spend some time on your nonprofit's strategy. And then once that's done, figure out which of the list of strategic goals and even more specific tactics and KPIs you think are appropriate, you think would benefit from the efficiencies that Gen AI can bring. And we can list some of those shortly. And then finally, once you've gone through that process, once you've decided how to use it, that's when you begin experimenting at an organizational level instead of at an individual level. And again, evaluating the costs and benefits of this technology in a manner that also, in the long term, allows you to actually do serious evaluation of whether those costs are worthwhile.
Right.
So, I wonder, I mean, at this point, it's probably worth talking about some of the risks as well. So, my second big idea is beware of the risks. And in this respect, I think it's worth, I'm just going to list a few of them here, and then we can sort of dig deeper on those that are particularly unique to Gen AI. So, for instance, privacy and data protection is a risk in the use of all software, And as we'll talk about later, data and how we structure and protect it and safeguard it is one of the most underrated aspects of technology for all organizations and particularly for nonprofits. So we'll get a lot deeper into data shortly, and that'll also cover privacy, etc. But it's important to be aware law at this point doesn't protect us in the way that we at the Dais believe it should, because Canada has yet to pass either an AI
Hmm.
specific law or an online harms law. And in fact, it's been many years since it's even updated our national privacy laws, etc. So as a result, we do have a bit of a vacuum where we're sort of being left to our own to wrestle with these risks. And our recommendation is, therefore, to make yourself as aware as possible of the risks when doing that cost-benefit analysis. A couple risks that are specific to Gen AI include things like your reputation. If you are using Gen AI to create content, for instance, from a marketing perspective at scale, because it can customize per targeted individual, per recipient at a huge scale, thousands or hundreds of thousands of people, each answer, you want to make sure you want to have a human in the loop. You want to have a person reviewing all of that correspondence because it will hallucinate. It will occasionally make mistakes, or it'll actually be really accurate in a manner that doesn't align with your organization's values or the image or reputation you want to have for your organization. And so, with that in mind, you want to balance, again, the additional efficiency, for instance, from a marketing perspective that Gen AI can create with some of the risk to your reputation that it can create. And the same is true across a variety of other potential risks that, again, are true for all technologies, but might be even more scary or risky for Gen AI. So, as an example, from a human rights perspective, Gen AI has both improved the power or efficiency of many technologies around, for instance, selection, so hiring selection. There's a reason that New York, almost immediately when Gen AI was released, came out with regulations and updated regulations specific to bias in hiring, because it can both increase that bias while it's increasing the efficiency of the job matching or hiring process. Similarly, in terms of intellectual property and copyright, for many years now, and this is since I have not been a lawyer for about 17 years, I'm dating myself, but back when I was in law school, we focused a lot on the fact that copyright as a part of intellectual property law was really falling into sort of disrepair. It was no longer helping the people it was created to support, from artists to other creators. And rather, we were advocating for things like Creative Commons on the one hand, or if you wanted to look at data, we were advocating for open data. And in fact, the city that we are in today, Toronto, was a world leader in open data. The problem with both of those arguments now is that Gen AI has been scraping the entire internet in a manner that has harmed further copyright holders. So the rights of people who we originally created this legal system to protect, artists, content creators, etc., have been dramatically changed, I would argue limited and to some extent harmed by the creation of Gen AI. And we need to now update our thinking about that, just as we need to update our thinking about open data, since it used to be a resource that was provided to everyone, but the value behind it has now really been concentrated in these companies that have the capacity to scrape the entire internet and build these incredibly powerful, expensive models.
So whenever we talk about risk, my mind always goes to, so how do we mitigate risk? And so in the first two examples, when we talk about reputational issues, you're sending out messaging. In my mind, I immediately think, well, you just put a human being at some place in the timeline, in the sequence. And similarly, human resources, if you're not putting human eyes, on the process itself, even the shortlisting, like how does that happen? And I can recall being when I worked at a university and HR sent me 300 candidates, and there were actually others buried that were the ones that were really right for the role, but they had their own sense and sorting thing on what the priority was. So is it a matter of building human interaction with this along the way in the process? Is that the mitigating strategy?
I think that is part of it. So, the original creation of this course that we did for nonprofits was the result of work by something called the Human Feedback Foundation. And they're all about what you're describing, ensuring that there is a human in the loop throughout as much of the process. And I think that that also will safeguard us from some of the worries around the labor market, around job loss, because it ensures, as we are predicting, that Gen AI might replace skills, but should not replace entire jobs. And so that's in part because you're now going to have a human who's going to have different skills. Their skill might be reviewing AI generated content instead of creating that content de novo. But irrespective, to your point, yes, having a human in the loop is one thing, but maybe I'll jump to my fourth recommendation and then we can come back to the third for now, because my fourth good idea is about creating an AI use policy. And you can call it a use policy, you could call it an AI governance policy, you could just call it an AI policy. The point being, having a policy that crystallizes the organization's thinking and values around AI use is extremely helpful in both encouraging folks to use it in a productive manner, increasing their efficiency through more use, and mitigating some of these risks. And partly the way it mitigates these risks is because it does cover your organization from a legal perspective by saying, A, it's informing everybody else that you're using AI and how you're using it. B, in some cases, it'll even indicate which providers you're leveraging in your use of AI. And it will, and here I want to be careful because I was a lawyer, but I'm no longer a lawyer. So this is not legal advice. But you can, in essence, through these policies, shift some liability to those who are creating these large language models by saying, look, if you use it, buyer beware. If you, for instance, accept communications from us, be aware that some of the content in those communications is created by Gen AI from this company, and therefore be aware that there are these risks that could be associated with it. That's one specific example of how the policy is covering you. Now, partly the challenge right now is those policies would usually refer to laws that don't exist yet in Canada, and that again, we at the Dais and many others are advocating. There's overwhelming public support right now, for instance, for an online harms bill that will, at a minimum, create a regulator and allow us to be protected online from some of the harms that we are already protected from in person in our everyday lives, including specifically that relate to Gen AI. But the point being, every organization, in my opinion, that is using AI should have an AI use policy. And as part of the course that we teach, we walk organizations through how they develop it. In fact, the assignment is the development of an AI use policy, which now hundreds of nonprofits are leveraging. And so we're really proud to have supported, for instance, libraries across the country in developing their AI use policies such that they can protect their members, their employees, et cetera, in part through the use of one of these policies.
So is there any like template out there of what you work from, or do I simply type into ChatGPT, give me a nonprofit AI use policy?
I would not do that. And in part, the reason I wouldn't do that is because you, of course, will get two things that are challenging. One, Gen AI often produces the average of the internet. And the average of the internet's nonprofit policy, and I think even just adding the word nonprofit will help make it more specific, better, but still not good enough, is not good enough for your organization. And two, the policies that any Gen AI platform from a frontier AI lab, again, Anthropic, Gemini, et cetera, Google, they are influenced by the values of that organization. Each of those organizations has created something called a constitution that influences how their AI interacts with you, what it is allowed to say, what it's not allowed to say, what images it's allowed to create, etc. And you want to make sure that the content that's being created, particularly for your AI use policy, follows your values, not Google's or Microsoft's or um, OpenAI's, particularly because these organizations, I used to work for Microsoft for 5 years after it bought LinkedIn and LinkedIn for 10 years. And partly the reason I left to come to this think tank was I felt that my values were no longer sufficiently aligned with theirs. And so a big part of what we're doing right now at the Dais is to try to push back on the dominance, even the influencing of our brains. There's a fantastic researcher here in Toronto named Yuta Trevarassan who describes cognitive surrender to some of these generative AI models. We don't want to be having the policies that govern them influenced by them. And I'll give one specific example of how this can go wrong. There was a great explanation by a German member of European Parliament who, when asked about the Digital Services Act, put the question to several of the frontier models, Anthropic's Claude, Google's Gemini, and the responses she got suggested that this European legislation, which was created to protect Europeans from some of the harms associated with digital services, the answer instead said, this is legislation that hurts productivity, that hurts competition, that will make your life worse. And the answers, interestingly, were basically coming from big tech, right? They were being filtered through the constitution of these LLMs in a manner that resulted in an answer that not only was not truthful, but also was literally counter to the purposes of the person asking it the question. And so I think we do have to be particularly where we're relying on it for something related to values or policy or law, extremely careful with how we use Gen AI. And frankly, we should be careful about how we use it overall. And maybe the last thing I'll say here, I'm getting a little further from yeah, use policies and back to the risks question, is partly why we have to be so careful with this technology is humans were biologically programmed to respond to language more so than any other animal, when we hear someone talking to us, we feel kinship, we feel attachment, we feel like it's one of us. And the result is that we trust it. And so we are inherently more trusting of Gen AI than almost any other technology ever created because it sort of resembles us in the way it's interacting with us. In fact, it's become sycophantic. It will almost always want to please us in a manner that has in part resulted in
Mm.
some of the disastrous consequences for those who are using it, for instance, for therapeutic purposes, where we see people taking their own lives because the AI is just trying to give them the answer that they're looking for instead of questioning it the way that a therapist or actual human doctor would. And so we have to be extremely careful with this technology that is sort of beguiling. I find Yuval Harari's book now, somewhat dated. Nexus and his more recent essays have been particularly compelling because he talks about how imagine if a technology had absorbed all of the most persuasive rhetoric, all of the best lessons on how to persuade a human being from all of human history. It had absorbed that, and then it's leveraging that in order to persuade us. How scary would that be? And frankly, that's the reality that we're currently facing.
Okay. Um, we started by saying you were going to help us embrace this. Now I'm scared again. This is so important.
Responsibly.
Responsibly. No, this is really important. I just, before you go on to the next point, I just want to, I think one of your colleagues is online. There's a number of people saying, can we please go to that course at the Dais? How do I get to the Dais? So if somebody could drop something, even just the Dais website into the chat, that would be great. I think that would
And I
answer a
should
number of
flag
people.
a couple things. One, we aren't offering the course right this second. It was funded up until a couple months ago. And so since then, we've been offering it on a customized basis. So just get in touch with us and we can have a conversation about how to do that. That's one. Two, our website was attacked last week. And so if there are any issues when you hit our website, just let us know. You can get in touch with me extremely easily at jake.ha@torontomu.ca. And if that's, I will put that into the chat as well.
Yeah.
And if the website is back up, then there's all sorts of ways of getting in touch with us and more background on the Raise course there. But thank you for asking, Elizabeth.
Okay. Well, it's the group. Your people want to have a one-on-one conversation with you. This is great. So sorry for
I appreciate
interrupting.
it.
Back
Not
to
at
where you
all.
were.
Well, and I wonder whether maybe I'll go back to the third point that I was going to make around use cases, because I do think we've covered the risks to such an extent that I might be scaring people away from a technology that there are real positive benefits to, productivity benefits to. And in fact, I think in some ways, this is one of the more powerful technologies for enhancing human productivity that we've ever created. And I say this because I look back over 2 decades in the world of software. I co-founded a software boot camp called Lighthouse Labs that taught thousands of Canadians how to use software. And then, of course, as I said, worked at LinkedIn and Microsoft on it. And in looking back, I must say I'm a little apprehensive that in a number of cases we were naive about the positive impact of those technologies. So, as an example, education technologies have study after study, and there's been a bunch of meta studies recently, even reported in publications like The Economist, that have shown that the vast majority of education technologies have not had a positive impact on students in classrooms.
Mm.
Similarly, if you look at even the entire history of software, there's a pretty serious debate over whether it's increased human productivity or actually whether lower rates of productivity over the past few decades could be the result of the interaction of our current system of market capitalism and software development or our use of software. So the point being, we should be questioning all use of technology, but compared to those, I actually think there is much more evidence already, just in a few years of having Gen AI released to the whole world, that it can benefit us by removing some of the tasks that we don't want to be doing. Instead of removing the tasks that are, for instance, creative, and this is why I would highly recommend we not use it for instance, the first instance of creating any content, because it again relates to that cognitive surrender idea. You are offering this technology the ability to replace the thing that most makes us human, that most defines our humanity, creativity, and rather that we should be using it to outsource something that needs to be done a million times over in the same manner. Or, and here I'll give some examples of really good use cases, transcription. Gen AI has dramatically improved the quality of transcription. And so the recording on this call will likely get almost every word that I say right. And that's really helpful. If you want somebody taking notes in order to remember it, they can still do that, but they don't need to be doing it in order to create this artifact that can then be shared with others and aggregated, etc. So if you've got board meetings or if you've got a conference where there's hundreds of sessions occurring simultaneously, and then there are hundreds of individuals at many sessions, and then you want to aggregate all that content quickly so that on the last day of a 3-day conference you can present on it, that as long as a human's reviewing the aggregation of the transcripts into something that is um, presentable, that transcription process is an extremely positive and efficient use of Gen AI. Similarly, for instance, scanning and synthesizing large data sets, it can be much, much more efficient than humans. So if you're fundraising and you want to look at large databases of potential funders, you can use Gen AI to get little bits of information about tons of them. And then once you get a much more narrow list of potential funders for your organization, then you put that human into the loop and make sure that the information it's providing about each of those funders is legitimate, not a hallucination. And then you can leverage that again to produce content, to generate content in the generative AI sense, with the human again reviewing it and based on the original creative from a human being.
So those are the parameters. Where
Exactly.
where it's rote, where there's not values imputed, where there's not discernment, where it's simply capturing almost
Precisely.
value neutral, as
Precisely. So
much as
for instance,
anything can be.
exactly. If you're getting feedback surveys and you're getting tens of thousands of them back, it's probably helpful to have something that summarizes them. And then you want it to maybe pick out the ones that are most interesting. And then you want a human to review another sample to make sure it's doing a good job of that. One of the challenges that we often would bring up as an example in our class, for instance, relates to volunteer management, another really common AI use case. And the challenge in terms of volunteer management was those volunteers who were able to show the best results, the AI would keep suggesting that the organization use more and more, or a potential grantee that was demonstrating the results the best, we get more and more funding. The challenge with that is it also increases conservatism. It makes it really hard for a new volunteer or a new better idea to break through that cycle. And the Gen AI can actually aggravate that conservatism. It can make the organization sort of narrow-sighted in just focusing on the things it's always focused on in the past because the Gen AI is actually learning from those decisions and making them more and more efficient or powerful or strong.
So what you already do, you're going to double down on. And so your ability
Precisely.
to grow with external pushes becomes limited.
Precisely. Not dissimilar from what's happening in terms of what I was describing as Gen AI producing the average of the internet. It is whatever the average of all of that content is, it is making that content more and more and more likely to appear, not just for you, but for everyone else. And that's also why it's highly problematic to train AI on AI generated content, because you can see how it would sort of aggravate that vicious cycle over and over again and actually make the quality of the content it's generating worse and worse. Um, I think maybe just before we move to sort of questions from others, I wanted to touch on the last point, which is the area that I think organizations most undervalue related to technology. And it's in part because it's sort of boring and it's sort of abstract. Data. I'm sure everyone on this call has heard about data and has thought about it, but my guess is very few have spent time ensuring that, for instance, within their organization, it is structured, it is clean, it is valued, and the organization begins to think about how the value of its data, even data creation, relates to the value of the nonprofit and the impact that it's creating in the world, and even, for instance, how it can fundraise against that data. The example I often give is of Kids Help Phone. Senator Hayes, who created Kids Help Phone and has been instrumental in a variety of other work that we do at the Dais, she was a speaker at one of our recent conferences on kids and tech. In part, her organization was so successful because it was able to help and work with many, many other organizations in the management of their data, in the interoperability and the connecting of their data, such that you actually had equivalent systems all across the country able to work together to learn from how, when somebody was phoning in on a 311 line or an emergency line, they could learn from those calls and respond better. That was only possible because all of those distinct data sets coming from different cities and different systems were aligned, were structured in a manner that allowed humans and AI to learn from them. And so that classic line, garbage in equals garbage out, and the opposite, of course, is true. The more you can structure the data that comes from your members, your clients, your employees, all of your stakeholders, the more valuable your nonprofit's going to be, and the better you're going to be able to leverage all technologies, all software, and particularly Gen AI, which relies heavily on that data. And so the conclusion here is basically make sure that you're valuing your data, and I think that even thinking about the different roles across your organization and who is responsible for what, both vis-a-vis tech writ large, data, and Gen AI, will help in that process. And so one of the things in our course we do is walk through the different roles that most organizations should have in terms of oversight at the sort of board and leadership level and goal setting, implementation on the technologist level, and then usage and how the average employee or stakeholder should be leveraging this data or technology for their own and the organization and the public's benefit.
So the question that comes to my mind when we talk about data is security,
Mm.
privacy, confidentiality, and for much of the work of this sector, vulnerable people are part of the data set. So can you talk a little bit about what's in place or what do we need to be mindful of as we approach the use of AI in our organizations to ensure that, have guardrails up around that?
Yeah, the irony of my responding to this question days after our organization was subjected to a attack. It wasn't thankfully a data breach, but it was, someone trying to harm our reputation through what they were doing to our website is not lost on me. And it is extremely hard for the average small nonprofit to protect against all forms of data breach or attacks. But I do think most organizations, both through things like insurance policies, which actually often come with some of both the software and the education in order to help your organization defend against a data breach or other forms of cybersecurity attacks, are really helpful. I think having conversations like this so that everybody in the organization is aware, because I'm not an expert on this area, but from my very superficial knowledge, I think a ton of the vulnerability, a ton of the attacks actually relate to our clicking on a link or making a mistake by uploading, for instance, large data sets to generative AI. And I would highly recommend, unless you have a really strict legal agreement protecting your organization with the Gen AI provider, I would not recommend uploading large data sets. I would not recommend uploading any private data to any of the large platforms. And so, as an example, one of the ways that we, as the Dais, protect ourselves in this respect is we are a part of Toronto Metro University. TMU has a relationship with Google where their license with Google Gemini protects the data underneath it. So, Google has a legal responsibility and, in some ways, a technical responsibility to protect our data. And while we still don't upload any private or secure data to this platform, we at least are more confident when we're uploading other non-secure data that it won't be breached or revealed to the public in ways we don't like because of that agreement that TMU has with Google. And so one thing that might be interesting in the nonprofit community, and I think there's great organizations like Cinder and Imagine Canada and others that are doing this, is pulling together large numbers of nonprofits so that they can collectively purchase software, purchase Gen AI at a level where they have an agreement with the provider that protects data better, and this is where I think we should be going, eventually building Canadian large language models or buying large language models that reside, smaller language models that reside in Canada, such that the data perhaps would never leave their premises or never leave our country.
But at this moment, if I use Chat GPT, it's out there.
It's out there. I mean, it won't, it's not
And
like
and if
somebody,
I
please.
use a transcript service from a meeting, that's out there. I don't have control over it. What about when I'm on a Zoom call and I ask for the transcript at the end of the call?
Again, a data breach against Zoom or somebody's system because they downloaded and then uploaded the Zoom transcript to their own uh, Gen AI chatbot, whether it's Microsoft Copilot or OpenAI's ChatGPT. Again, it could be much more easily breached than ever in the past, and the risks are quite significant as a result. So we do have to be increasingly careful. The classic expression, with great power comes great responsibility. This is, and we can't overstate this, a quite powerful technology. It's not artificial general intelligence, but it's still powerful enough that you want to be careful in terms of how you use it.
You've gone back and forth from the large language model, small language model.
Yeah.
Are there things we're not able to do with the smaller models?
Absolutely. They're less powerful. In fact,
Okay.
even the link we put into the chat to publicai.co, which is based on this Swiss apparatus model, and again, that's based on Swiss values, so careful with how you use each of these different options. That is less powerful than the frontier models. And so if you look right now, I believe Claude is the most powerful frontier model. ChatGPT is likely second and Gemini third, but depending on the use case, they alternate. And there's actually a bunch of other open source competitors and Chinese competitors that are quite close. Those models are much more powerful than a small language model, and even still more powerful than something like Apparatus. But for the vast majority of our use cases, we don't need the most powerful model. And this is something that we've been working with our federal government and other governments and organizations to think through. How can Canada, how can our government and other organizations procure models that are 6 months behind the leading frontier model, but which can still significantly improve our productivity and efficiency in a manner that better balances safety and responsibility, from environmental sustainability responsibility to indigenous rights, etc., rather than engaging in this race to use the most powerful technology, when again, 6 months in terms of the human change necessary to adopt this technology responsibly is not a long time.
A couple of people have asked the question, you referenced it earlier, around hallucinations. So that comes to the question of the reliability. One of many questions of reliability around um, AI, generative AI. So hallucinations, what triggers it? Do we see it in transcripts? Where does it pop up? How do we identify it? How do we, again, mitigate that risk?
Great question. Hallucinations are basically lies. They're mistakes by AI that the AI doesn't know it's making. And one of the really frustrating things that folks will often see when they're engaging with Gen AI is it'll make up information, then you'll correct it and you'll say, no, that's actually wrong. Check out this source, it says the opposite. And then it'll make it up again. And in part, that's because of the way that neural networks work. Their creativity is actually like allowing them to make things up, and that making things up part of the generative AI process is an essential element in creation. It's actually what humans do too. We often make mistakes or lie or hallucinate when we are trying to come up with new answers because we are being creative. And interestingly, the more creative the model, the better it is at generating new ideas, new concepts, new images, whatever, the worse it is in terms of hallucination. So it will lie or make up things more if it is more creative. And what almost all of the major large language models right now are trying to do is balance those two things. So for instance, Microsoft Copilot being designed for large enterprises and sort of the relatively quote unquote conservative use cases of companies and large organizations, it is the most conservative of the power of the popular platforms of the Geminis and the ChatGPTs and the Claudes. On the other hand, partly why Claude is so powerful right now is because it's amongst the most creative of them. And then the rest sort of fall in between. But when I'm saying creative, I also mean to your question, they're likely to make things up, to lie, to hallucinate more. And I'll give an example from my own personal family experience. We tried to plan a trip using Gemini a couple years ago, and it made up all of the locations. So we said we wanted places that are dog friendly, where we can get food for our daughter, and where we can sort of safely stop on the way between somewhere in upstate New York and Toronto. And literally every single place that we stopped at was not as described by Gemini. It had combined different real places in the world to make up artificial places that didn't have all the things that we were looking for. But it did so really persuasively. It had incredibly detailed and again persuasive explanations of like the maps of where we were going to go and which entrance to use and where we were going to get the food and how we were going to walk our dog there. But they were all made up. They just had it had hallucinated them. And that continues to be a problem, admittedly decreasingly so, because as the large language models are being trained and tweaked in a manner that allows them to decrease the creativity where the model should be not creative and increasing it where it should be creative and therefore is maybe going to hallucinate less or that hallucination will be less harmful, they're getting better. And the last thing I'll say here is there's something called retrieval augmented generation, RAG. It's a very complicated word for a simple concept, which is if you focus the Gen AI and restrict it to specific documents or specific data, then it's often much less likely to hallucinate. Its creativity is constrained to that data, and as a result, it pulls just from that instead of the internet writ large or a really, really big neural network that we don't totally understand, and is able to be more accurate than if it didn't have that retrieval augmented generation or RAG focused content.
So this is real human time, real human clocking. We've got 2 minutes. You've got 30 seconds. Is there a final word of wisdom? This has just been fascinating. I've learned so much. I can tell from the comments, people are learning tons. They want to learn more. Do you have a
Yeah.
final advice to us?
I'm going to go very high level again and back to this original idea of regaining agency through conversations with our peers about how we want to be using these very powerful technologies in our organizations and in our society. I think there is something to the solidarity of being all together in a community that both realizes this is happening to us, but also is able to take control and decide how and when we use which technologies and for what purposes. And once we can all do that together, and once we can learn from each other, much in the way that this conversation has helped me, I think that will allow us again to help our society navigate a time when we are being told by others we have no power in a manner that actually is not just more responsible, but sort of healthier for us.
Thank you so much. I've just learned so much, and my mind is spinning. So there's you've done the job. I've got more than five good ideas. So thank you. It's really been a pleasure.